Okay, thank you for attending, everyone. My name is Bill Brown, and I'm the director of the school, and we are going to discuss the Americans with Disabilities Act policy that has been enacted this year. So, without further ado, I'm going to read the policy to everyone. You should all have a copy in front of you. So, this policies and procedures for students with disabilities. Accommodation procedures for students with disabilities, grievance procedures for students who have complaints on the basis of disability. And so we're going to start off with accommodation procedures for students with disabilities. So here's our non-discrimination policy. It is the policy of Brownson Technical School to comply with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which are federal laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability. Brownson Technical School does not discriminate on the basis of disability against a qualified person with a disability in regards to application, acceptance, grading, advancement, training, discipline, graduation, or any other aspect related to the student's participation in a program of Brownson Technical School. This applies to all students and applicants for admission to the school. Brownson Technical School will provide reasonable accommodation to students with disabilities. This is the definition of an individual with disabilities. An individual with a disability is a person who has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities of the individual. These persons are protected by Sections 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, or known as ADA. Individuals with a record of such impairment and individuals who are regarded as having such an impairment are also protected by these federal laws. The definition of a disability in Section 504 and the ADA should be interpreted to allow for broad coverage. The phrase physical impairment means psychological disorder or condition, a cosmetic disfigurement, or an anatomical loss that affects one or more of the following body systems: neurological, musculoskeletal, special sense organs, which would include speech organs that are not respiratory, such as vocal cords, soft palate, tongue, etc. Respiratory, including speech organs, cardiovascular, reproductive, digestive, genitourinary, hemic, or lymphatic. Skin and endocrine. Examples include, but are not limited to, orthopedic, visual, speech, hearing impairment, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, muscular dystrophy, multiple sclerosis, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, HIV disease, symptomatic or asymptomatic, tuberculosis, drug addiction, and alcoholism. The phrase mental impairment means any mental or physiological disorder included but not limited to mental retardation, organ-brain syndrome, emotional or mental illness, specific learning disabilities, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and bipolar disorder. The phrase substantially limits must be interpreted without regard to ameliorative effects of mitigating measures other than ordinary eyeglasses or contacts. Second page. Contact lenses. Mitigating measures are things like medications, prosthetic devices, assistive devices, or learned behavior or adaptive neurological modifications that an individual may use to eliminate or reduce the effects of an impairment. These measures cannot be considered when determining whether a person has a substantially limiting impairment. An impairment that is episodic or in remission is a disability if, when an active phase It would substantially limit a major life activity. For example, a student with bipolar disorder would be covered if during manic or depressive episodes the student is substantially limited in a major life activity. In other words, thinking, concentrating, neurological function, or brain function. The phrase major life activity means functions such as caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, and working. Major life activities also include major bodily functions, such as functions of the immune system, normal cell growth, and digestive, bowel, bladder, neurological, brain, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. The school's responsibility to students with disabilities is as follows. The school must provide academic adjustments, auxiliary aids, and reasonable accommodations to students with disabilities that are necessary to ensure students are not denied the benefits of or excluded from participating in the school's program. The school must make modifications to its academic requirements that are necessary to ensure that the requirements do not discriminate against students with disabilities. The school must ensure that it provides physical access to students with disabilities. It is also the responsibility to permit students with disabilities to use service dogs on each campus. The person responsible for implementing these responsibilities at Brownson Technical School is Paula Locke, ADA coordinator. Her office location is at the front office of Brownson Technical School. Her telephone number is 714-774-9443. Email address is ada@brownson.edu. When a student informs a staff member that the student is disabled or needs accommodations or assistance due to disability, the staff member will refer the student to the school's ADA compliance coordinator. These are the procedures for students in the school. Documentation of disability by students. Students with disabilities who wish to request reasonable accommodations, including academic adjustments, auxiliary aids, or modifications, must contact the ADA compliance coordinator named above for their campus. Students must provide documentation of disability from an appropriate professional, which depends on the nature of the disability. For example, a student with a psychological disability should provide documentation from a psychologist, psychiatrist, or social worker. Going on to page 3. This documentation may be the student's existing medical records or reports created by the student's medical provider or an appropriate professional who conducts an assessment of the student. It may be documentation from the student's past educational records, such as reports from teachers or school psychologists, or records that show the student's educational history, disability assessment, and the accommodations the student previously received. It may be records from the State Department of Rehabilitation or the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Documentation should be current and relevant, but that does not mean that a recent report or record is needed in all cases. Some disabilities are stable, lifelong conditions, and historic documentation will be sufficient. Some disabilities are readily apparent and observable, and thus little or no documentation will be needed. The documentation of disability is kept at all times in a locked, private file at the school to protect privacy. Direct access to this documentation is by written consent only. The ADA compliance coordinator will determine what information needs to be shared with staff and learning leaders on an as-needed basis in order to facilitate academic accommodations or other services. Student requests for accommodations and interactive discussion with ADA compliance coordinator. Students who plan to request accommodations should contact the ADA compliance coordinator promptly, so there is time for the coordinator to review the student's documentation and discuss accommodations with the student before the student begins the class or program for which the accommodation is being requested. When a student contacts the coordinator will keep a record of the dates and contacts with the student, including a record of the accommodations requested by the student. Students who have questions about the type of accommodations they need to provide should contact the coordinator to discuss this. The student and the ADA compliance coordinator will discuss how the student's impairment affects the student, how the student expects the impairment to impact the student in the school's program, the types of accommodations the student has previously received, if any, and the accommodations being requested by the student from the school. The coordinator and the student should discuss accommodations needed during all phases of the program, which are core, adaptive, and creative, and for classroom instruction skills based on instruction and skills practice. The documentation for observation must show the nature of the student's disability and how it limits a major life activity. The accommodations requested by the student should be related to these limitations. There are no preset accommodations for specific disabilities. Instead, the coordinator and the student must discuss and determine what the student's limitations are and how they can be accommodated. Here are some examples. A student with an orthopedic disability may need to have cushioned floor mats and scheduled times to sit down. These students may also need a particular kind of chair. Page 4. A student with a learning disability or attention deficit disorder may need extra time to take tests, such as 90 minutes to take a test instead of the 60 minutes allowed to other students. These students may need to take their tests in a location that is quiet and has no distractions, such as an office rather than the classroom. A student with a learning disability or psychological disability may need a note taker or a copy of the instructor's notes or presentation, or to use a tape recorder during the instruction. A student with post-traumatic stress disorder or an anxiety disorder may need to take periodic leaves of absence or may need to structure their program so that it is scheduled over a longer period of time than usual. These students may need to take breaks in a quiet room during skills practice. A student with a hearing impairment may need instructors to use voice amplification systems, or they may need the school to provide a sign language interpreter. A student with diabetes may need periodic breaks to check his or her blood sugar levels. Okay. Decisions about accommodations and ensuring implementation of accommodations. The ADA compliance coordinator will decide the accommodations to be provided to the student. The coordinator will consider any past accommodations that have been effective for the student and will give primary consideration to the type of accommodation required by the student. Alternative accommodations may be provided if there is an alternative accommodation that would be equally effective for the student. The coordinator will make a decision no later than 2 weeks after the student states the request for an accommodation. If the student does not submit documentation of a disability at the time the student requests an accommodation, the coordinator will make a decision no later than 2 weeks after the student provides the documentation. The coordinator will list the approved accommodations in writing and provide this to the student. The coordinator will inform the appropriate learning leaders and school staff of the accommodations they are responsible for providing to the student, how to provide the accommodations, and when to provide the accommodations. The coordinator will keep a written record of these contacts about the student's accommodations. The coordinator will verify the accommodations are being implemented for the student through direct observation, reports by the student, and/or documentation from the school staff. If the student informs the coordinator that an accommodation is not being fully implemented, the coordinator will immediately intervene with a relevant staff member to ensure that the accommodation is provided to the student. After accommodations have been approved for a student, the coordinator will make an appointment with the student for a time when the student's program is expected to change. The purpose of this appointment is to determine whether the student's, page 5, going to page 5, Accommodations should be changed when the student's program phase changes or the type of instructional changes. These are additional factors. The school is not obligated to provide accommodations that would result in a fundamental alteration of the school's program. In this case, the coordinator will promptly search for an equally effective alternative accommodation for the student that would not fundamentally alter the program. The coordinator will offer the alternative accommodation to the student. The school is not obligated to provide accommodations that would result in an undue financial or administrative burden on the school. If the coordinator decides that the request for accommodation might impose such burden, the coordinator will discuss the issue with the school owner, who will take into account overall financial resources of the school. The school owner will make the final decision in accord with requirements of Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. If the school owner determines the requested accommodation would be an undue burden, the coordinator will promptly search for an equally effective alternative accommodation for the student and offer that accommodation, offer the alternative accommodation to the student. This is appeals by students. The student may appeal any accommodation decision made by the ADA compliance coordinator. If the student disagrees with the decision, here are some examples. A student may appeal the coordinator's decision to deny a requested accommodation. A student may appeal the decision by the coordinator to provide an alternative accommodation rather than the specific accommodation requested by the student. A student may appeal the decision by the coordinator that the student has not presented sufficient documentation to support the requested accommodation. The student may also file an appeal when the school staff member fails to provide an approved accommodation and the coordinator has not effectively addressed the situation. When a student wishes to file an appeal, the student must notify Paula Locke, Registrar, Front Office of Brownson Technical School, 714-774-9443, email ada@brownson.edu. The student must explain his or her reasons for disagreeing with the coordinator's decision, or explain how the student's accommodation is not being implemented and submit any relevant documentation. Within 5 calendar days of receiving the student's appeal, the director will meet with the student and the coordinator to discuss the issue presented by the student's appeal. If appropriate, the director will also discuss the issue with other staff members. When a student appeals a decision made by the coordinator, the director will determine whether the coordinator's decision should be revised or remain the same. If the decision is revised, the director will ensure that the revised decision is implemented. Page 6. When a student files an appeal on the basis of an approved accommodation, let me start over. When a student files an appeal on the basis that an approved accommodation is not being implemented, the director will determine whether the accommodation is being fully implemented, and if not, ensure the accommodation is implemented. The director will inform the student of the decision in writing no later than 14 days after receiving the student's appeal. These are training and mediation responsibilities of the ADA compliance coordinator. The ADA compliance coordinator at the campus will deliver disability training sessions for all campus staff members at least once each calendar year. In these training sessions, the coordinator will explain the basic requirements of Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act as they apply to the school. The coordinator will address the school's responsibility to provide accommodations to students with disabilities, how to appropriately interact with students in particular kinds of disabilities, how to go about implementing accommodations that the coordinator has approved for students, how to support students with disabilities in the school's program. The students with disabilities cannot be penalized for using approved accommodations. The coordinator will keep a record of each training session. The coordinator may provide training for students who wish to learn about the school's process for providing accommodation or about the school's grievance procedure. To help ensure that future campus staff members and students are aware of the school's policies, the coordinator will make sure the accommodation procedures, the grievance procedures, are continually posted at the campus. The coordinator will assist students with disabilities who have concerns about implementation of their accommodations or the treatment by the school staff members or other students. At the request of a student, the coordinator will informally mediate or attempt to resolve issues related to the student's disability. If this informal process does not resolve the student's concerns, the student may file a grievance described in section 2 below. This is section 2. Grievance procedures for students who have complaints on the basis of disability. The policy is, Paula Locke is responsible for providing a grievance procedure to students who feel that they have been discriminated against on the basis of disability. The grievance procedure provides students the opportunity to file a complaint. The school then has responsibility to objectively investigate the allegations of the complaint and determine whether the student has been discriminated against. If the school determines the discrimination has occurred, the school must take appropriate steps to correct the discrimination and prevent it from reoccurring. Moving on to page 7. These are grievance complaints. A student may file a grievance if the student feels he or she has been discriminated against because the student is disabled, or because the student is regarded as being disabled, or because the student has a record of being disabled. The student may also file a grievance if the student feels he or she has been retaliated against for advocacy based on disability. Here are some examples of discrimination. An instructor or other students refer to the student in a derogatory way related to the student's disability. An instructor generally refers to students with particular types of disability in a derogatory way. Other students refuse to work with a student because the student is disabled. A school staff member refuses to provide service to the student that the staff member provides to other students. A school staff member takes a negative action towards the student after the student asks for accommodations for disability. A guest presenter at the school makes derogatory statements about students with disabilities or states that students with disabilities can never be employed in the presenter's field. A student's request for accommodation was denied by the school, or an instructor did not implement an accommodation for the student that was approved by the school. All right, a student must file a grievance complaint within 90 days of the date of the discriminatory act occurred, or within 90 days at the end of an informal attempt to resolve the complaint, whichever is later. The complaint must be written. In the complaint, the student must describe what happened and the dates the act took place and state who was involved. The student should explain why the student believes the acts were taken based on disability. The student should describe or provide copies of any relative documents or emails if available. A student may ask Campus ADA compliance coordinator to try and informally resolve the student's complaint before the student files a written complaint. However, the student is not required to try informal resolution before filing a written complaint. The complaint must be sent to Paula Locke, Registrar, Front Office, Brownson Technical School, 714-774-9443, ada@brownson.edu. Investigation of the complaint. When the director receives written complaint, the director will immediately begin an objective investigation. Note to the school, it may be advisable for the school to contract with an independent investigator to discuss these investigations. Within 7 days, turning to page 8, the director will discuss the allegations in the complaint with the student and obtain any needed additional information from the student. The director will obtain from the student the names of any persons the student believes will have relevant information. The director will gather all information necessary to determine what took place. To do so, the director will interview any school staff members or students who engaged in the actions or may have witnessed the actions that the student is complaining about. The director will interview persons that the student stated may have relevant information. The director will gather any relevant documentation such as emails, student work, or instructor's records. During the investigation, the director will disclose the complaint and confidential information about the student, only to the extent necessary to investigate the allegations of the complaint. After reviewing the evidence gathered, the director will determine whether the student was treated differently from other students based on disability, or whether the student was harassed based on disability, or whether the student was retaliated against because the student advocated on the basis of disability, or whether the student was denied an accommodation that the school should have provided to the student. Written decision. The director will provide the student with a written decision no later than 60 days after the date the student filed the complaint. The decision will state the determination reached by the director at the conclusion of the investigation and the reasons the director reached that determination. If the director concludes that the student was discriminated against on the basis of disability, the decision will state the types of remedial action that the school has taken or will take to correct the discrimination. The decision will also state how the school will prevent the discriminatory acts from occurring again. This is appealed by students. The student who filed the complaint disagrees with the decision made by the director or disagrees with the remedial action specified, the student may appeal the decision to the school owner. The appeal must be written and sent to the Brown Trust, 1110 Technology Circle, Anaheim, California, 92805, 714-426-4610, ada@brownson.edu. The appeal must state the specific reasons that the student disagrees with the decision. Appeals must be filed no later than 30 days after the student receives the written decision from the director. The owner will review the information provided by the student in the appeal, the discussion, and the decision by the director, the interview records made by the director, and the documentation gathered by the director. The owner will issue a written decision to the student within 14 days after receiving the student's appeal. The owner will determine whether the decision should be revised or remain the same. If the owner determines that the decision should be revised, the owner will ensure that any necessary changes to the remedies are implemented. Okay, the last page is simply who someone would contact, and I'm going to read it. U.S. Department of Education. Students or the school staff who have questions or concerns about disability issues may contact the Office for Civil Rights, known as OCR, U.S. Department of Education. OCR enforces Section 604 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act as they apply to post-secondary educational institutions. The OCR national headquarters is located at U.S. Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, Lyndon Baines Johnson, Department of Education Building, 400 Maryland Avenue Southwest, Washington, D.C. 20202-1100. Telephone numbers 800-421-3481. Fax 202-453-6012. And then the TDD, which is the number for the deaf, 877-521-2172. Email ocr@ed.gov. OCR has regional offices located throughout the country. To find the office for your state, you can check the OCR website at www.cfapps/OCR/contact-us.cfm, or call the telephone numbers above. With that, we're going to conclude this training session, and this will be posted on our website for review by people who weren't able to see it today, or just review if you have any questions you want to go back and review. Thank you.